Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the Wizard's Guide to Dyslexia. So the presenters for this project included my wife, Lauren Podesky, myself, I'm Chris Podesky, Michelle Henderson, and Natalie Haggerty. And we do represent a variety of institutions here in Hawaii. And unfortunately for you all, you will just be getting me. But this presentation was created by this whole group here. So in this presentation, we're going to define dyslexia. We're going to explore some of the strengths, right? Because we take a strengths-based approach to looking at dyslexia. And then we'll also give some tips for educators and parents alike for basically learning strategies and approaches that are most supportive to dyslexic kiddos. So let's begin. So first of all, what is dyslexia? Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. And what that means there is that it is specific to the language processing part of the brain. And it is a disorder that happens since birth and probably before birth. And it's something that is lifelong, right? And it's not something you can pick up later in life. So it's you're born with it, and there's no way to get rid of it. There's also no way to pick it up. You can't get dyslexia as a teenager, although you might be diagnosed as a teenager. So it is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So here we have kind of the some of the fundamentals, the foundational pieces of reading and writing. And you'll notice with Keiki with dyslexia is that it is more difficult than you would expect that it would be for that particular kid. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. I'll pause there, even though there's more to that sentence. So the phonological component of language is hearing sounds, and then also interpreting those sounds, and then analyzing them through the meaning of language. So then we get a little bit more into semantics there. And then it also has to do with producing sounds as well and producing language, right? So the phonological component is, I kind of look at it as the center of language comprehension and production. And with dyslexia, there is some kind of kink in that functioning that makes it so that language is more difficult than you would expect it would be. The second part of that sentence says the provision of effective classroom instruction. And essentially what this is saying is that if you had a kid who grew up in a cave, then obviously they wouldn't know language and they wouldn't be able to do all these reading and writing and speaking skills, and therefore but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have dyslexia, right? So the better explanation for being poor with those skills is a lack of instruction as opposed to having dyslexia. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And this is where we're starting to see some pretty serious consequences because, as we know, our country highly values reading and writing, and for dyslexics, like that's the thing that is very difficult due to the phonological processing. And whereas the student with dyslexia's peers are growing exponentially in their vocabulary and their background knowledge on a variety of topics due to reading and due to exposure to reading, our dyslexic kids don't get that. And so in many ways, it's a game of catch up for not only literacy skills, but all academic skills. So it is important to catch dyslexia early. Not that there's a cure, because there's not, but because there are strategies that teachers and parents can take to help kids learn to read, even with dyslexia. So, and that's why it's important to notice the signs so that it can lead to a diagnosis, or it can lead to instruction that's a better match for that kiddo. So in preschool, oftentimes it's harder to notice dyslexia because there's less familiarity, less exposure to letters, to the alphabet. And so therefore, you're going to notice the phonological pieces a lot more readily. So there's going to be troubles learning nursery rhymes, maybe, delayed speech or language development, although delayed speech is often associated with some other disorders too, like autism. Difficulty learning the alphabet and recognizing letters, and troubles with rhyming, segmenting, and blending sounds. So if you think of a word, you can segment that word. So I'll take the word cat. My Steve is right over here. He'll probably make an appearance soon. So Steve is my cat. So the word cat, right? So if you're segmenting, then you're taking the sounds of the word or the syllable and you're breaking it apart. So cat. For preschoolers, they might have troubles with segmenting those different sounds in the cat. They might just not hear the different sounds that make up the word. And then you have blending. So blending is where you take the pieces and then you blend them together. So blending, cat. Blend would be cat, right? So segmenting is splitting apart, blending is putting it together. And any of those tasks are really good for all kiddos to practice, but there's going to be noticeable challenges for many kids with dyslexia. Kindergarten, first grade, same as preschool, so these same issues will persist. And then, of course, in school, in elementary school, we have a big focus on letters, as we should. And there's going to be difficulties associating sounds with letters. So if a kid sees the word D, they might have a hard time knowing what sound to make for that letter D. And it's going to, sometimes it'll be like they'll make a B sound. So if it's the letter D and they make a B sound, one likely possibility is that they confuse the D and the B since they look pretty similar. Another thing that you'll notice is if it's a B sound, then they might make a V sound. So it's something similar, but not accurate. Poor spelling, slow, effortful reading, and avoidance of reading. In grades 2 through 4, we have all of the previous, plus frequently confusing letters that look similar. So I mentioned the B and the D. There's also P and Q that look similar. Guessing words based on the first letter. So this is a compensatory strategy, and it's a strategy that dyslexics will use in order to try to make up for not having all of those decoding skills down. So if they see the word cat, they might say a variety of short words that start with a C. They might say cow. They might say cab, right? They might say all sorts of words that are somewhat similar in length, and have that same first sound or the same first letter. And then difficulty writing complete sentences. You'll also see some pretty sloppy handwriting sometimes. That doesn't necessarily, again, each of these individual traits doesn't mean dyslexia, but it does mean a potential symptom of dyslexia. So you kind of have to look at it all together. Are we seeing most of these issues going on? or are we just seeing 1 or 2? In which case, if it's 1 or 2, that might point to something else. Grades 5 through 8, we have all of the previous, plus reading remains laborious, difficulty learning new vocabulary from text, avoids reading for pleasure, poor spelling and written expression. And then what I consider to be one of the more tragic components of dyslexia is this last piece here, where the students start to have a low self-esteem and then frustration around school. Sometimes it can lead to complex PTSD when reading, the act of reading and the embarrassment around the task, both the difficulty and then the embarrassment and the shame around poor reading skills, can lead to a very low self-esteem and school avoidance and reading avoidance. And this is one of the main aspects of dyslexia that, as teachers and parents, it's so necessary to combat, to help build these kids up who are at such a disadvantage when it comes to school, which is very, very much literacy based. You can't go to high school math class, science class, reading class, even many electives without having to engage in literacy. And when those literacy skills are poor, everything becomes difficult. So then let's look at what dyslexia looks like in high school and then all the way through adulthood. Notice that we have this common one, all of the previous grades. So even adults, even adult dyslexics with PhDs and authors and lawyers still have trouble with some of even the preschool symptoms that you'll see, such as trouble with rhymes, difficulty blending, segmenting, hearing sounds, saying the sounds correctly. Relies heavily on listening to learn. So Audible is a lifesaver here for me. I'm sorry, I didn't mention this earlier. I do have dyslexia. And I also have a PhD in literacy, and I teach teachers and pre-service teachers about literacy and about identifying or at least noticing the symptoms of dyslexia. So reading is difficult, continues to be difficult. Difficulty learning foreign languages. I've spent months and months in different countries, and my wife, who is what I would call hyperlexic, and I use that term to mean like extremely gifted in literacy, and so she picks up languages extremely easily, and I'm left kind of speaking like a caveman in English, while she's picking up Icelandic and of course Spanish and everything else. And of course experiences anxiety and shame around reading tasks. That does continue through adulthood. So I mentioned earlier how important it is to have a diagnosis or at least look into who likely has some issues with reading and what are some strategies or programs that we can use to help support the kid. And in order to figure out whether or not they're at risk or do have dyslexia, we have 2 different types of assessments. The first one is a screener. So screeners should be given to every single kid in every single school. That's my belief. We're not quite there yet, but I do think we're getting closer to that. Screeners can be administered by teachers or parents, and they're used to determine risk for dyslexia. So you can flag students who may be at risk, and then you can refer them for a diagnostic assessment, or perhaps you give extra instruction or some kind of intervention if you're a teacher for helping out with some individual skills. So there are some different examples of screeners. There are lots of good screeners out there. I won't preference any individual one, but there's a bunch out there. And again, just a reminder, this does not result in a dyslexia diagnosis, but this can result in being flagged for being at risk. So next up, we have the actual diagnostic assessment. This must be given by a licensed professional, and there are quite a few different diagnostic assessments that can be given. And again, it is fairly complex to diagnose in some cases. Dyslexia exists on a spectrum from being really great readers to being poor readers to having certain strengths in writing and terrible weakness in writing, right? So there's a big spectrum. Also in terms of how much it impacts schooling. For some kids, it is absolutely devastating. So their symptoms of dyslexia are such that it is absolutely devastating to the entire schooling experience. Other kids with dyslexia are mostly fine, right? They and some excel too. So there are adults who are diagnosed with dyslexia later in life, and they look back on their schooling, and some of them say, "It was fine. I liked reading. I just did it differently." Or, "Yeah, it was hard, but I thought it was hard for everybody, and it didn't bother me." So there's a huge range, and that's what also can make it a little bit complicated for a diagnosis. Another quick little factoid here is that the DSM-5 does not include dyslexia. So on the report, if someone has dyslexia, it'll most likely say something like specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. All right, so then we've looked at all of these symptoms, and we see that some of them are really severe, with potential to make schooling and learning very difficult and work very difficult too. So how common is it? Well, it's extremely common. 1 in 5 people, according to the IDA, have dyslexia. So 1 in 5, right? 20% of students may have it. In any classroom, if you have 20 students, 4 students probably have dyslexia. So we're talking about a huge number of kiddos. And not only is it common, but it also is extremely common with those with learning disabilities. So between 70 and 90%, according to a Yale study, 70 to 90% of individuals with learning disabilities have dyslexia. Again, 70 to 90%. So it's the most common of learning disabilities. It also affects boys and girls equally. However, for a range of reasons, boys are diagnosed more. And then there's an extremely high comorbidity. I don't like the word comorbidity, but a high co-occurrence with ADHD. And it's also interesting because many of the symptoms of dyslexia and the symptoms of ADHD in terms of working memory and in terms of, focus on the task, focus on reading, there's definitely some similarities there as well. So I've already covered some of this, but why does diagnosis matter? In order to truly help a kid with this disorder, good instruction needs to take place, and oftentimes that good instruction looks different. Although, in a really great class, a very skilled teacher will likely use dyslexia-friendly instructional practices, in which case their instruction might not look different. But for the most part, dyslexics need more time to do their reading. They need more explicit, systematic, and direct instruction. They need more practice, oftentimes more hands-on practice. And they sometimes need content presented in different ways. And then there's accommodations too. So there are multiple different ways that students can have accommodations that will help them become on the path to proficiency. So this is the first piece that is so critical and should be at the front of everyone's mind, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, or whether you yourself have dyslexia. And that is that there is the path to proficiency. Even more than that, dyslexic kids are perfectly capable of being advanced readers and advanced writers. But those accommodations and different instruction very likely needs to take place in order to get there. So learning to read is so critical that has to be priority. I'll call them 1 and 2 because the second piece is just as important. So if I'm saying this is priority 1, priority 2 is equal to it. And that's the second 2 points, which is to recognize that challenges are not due to laziness or lack of intelligence. And along with this, to let go of shame and misunderstandings. And I've mentioned this before, the terrible emotional devastation that many kids face and experience. And kids wake up so depressed and anxious about going to school because they have to spend eight hours, but 5 of which maybe are in classes. So you have 5 hours where the thing that you're bad at is the most valued thing in school, right? Which are literacy skills. So these two points I cannot state enough. But also, diagnosis matters because many dyslexics share some very powerful strengths that can overcome many of these difficulties. Dyslexic individuals are far outnumbered compared to where you think they would be in business and in many other jobs that require some of these strengths. So we have creativity, greater listening comprehension. This is likely due to the fact that since reading comprehension, there's a barrier to reading comprehension, listening comprehension is forced to improve, and that's where they get a lot of their information from, is from listening. Creativity, going back to this one, it's a little hard to say where this comes from. Many people think that it's kind of hardwired into the disorder, or, we can think of dyslexia as a neurodiversity, where it's just a difference in how the brain is composed, and it's a difference in the wiring, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just that sometimes it doesn't fit society's expectations. And like I said before, society puts such a value on literacy, which I think is fine, but it's problematic for dyslexic people. So creativity may very well be part of that wiring. So part of the wiring of a dyslexic brain is you're going to have a really hard time reading. You're going to have a really hard time with phonological awareness, but we're going to crank up the creativity. So who knows exactly what's going on there, but I like to think of it that way. Similarly, we have greater problem-solving skills and big picture thinking. There's a lot of pattern recognition too that goes on. I have mixed feelings about IQ, but what all of the research shows is that dyslexics have average to above average IQ, and again, I won't spend much time on that one. Moving on. Greater spatial reasoning skills, so architects and graphic designers, right, where spatial reasoning matters, that can come in. The last piece is very likely not hardwired into the brain of dyslexic, but is similar to listening comprehension, where it's sort of forced, They are some of the most resilient kids that you'll find in a school, right? So they, due to all of those issues that I discussed, every day, every school day, they're just going right back in it. The resilience that this builds really makes sense for why so many dyslexic people end up very successful. All right, so now we're going to ease into a little bit more interactive element. So you're at home on your computer or your phone. You can still play along with us, though. Okay. People with dyslexia are typically of blank intelligence. 1, 2, or 3. Go ahead and put your finger up or fingers up. And the answer is 3. Average to above average. In this image, who is dyslexic? So we have a variety of famous people, plus Dr. Natalie Haggerty's son. The answer is, of course, you probably know, all of them. All of these very successful people have dyslexia. And part of their success, so when you talk to a lot of these people, and other successful folks with dyslexia, what they're going to say is that they attribute their success to the disorder, and that if they wouldn't give it up, even if it meant that it was easier to read and easier to speak and learn foreign languages, they wouldn't give it up. They wouldn't give it up because of all of these strengths. So seeing the big picture, recognizing when there is an issue with an image, so those like odd one out images, those kind of quizzes, good spatial knowledge, picture thinkers, sharper peripheral vision, business entrepreneurs, so here 1 in 3, right? 1 in 3 are dyslexic. Highly creative and improved pattern recognition. So here we have Beryl Benacerraf. I apologize. I'm sure I did not say that name correctly. But I will just blame that on my dyslexia there. It's also good because you can blame things on it as well. So she's a radiologist. And she says, I recognized that I had dyslexia, and then I realized I had this gift for imaging. I live in a world of patterns and images, and I see things that no one else sees. Because of dyslexia, I can see these patterns. Again, because of dyslexia, I am successful. Because of dyslexia, I was able to create or improve upon this field of work. You can't overcome it. You can work around it and make it work for you, but it never goes away. That's probably a good thing, because if dyslexia went away, then the other gifts would go away too. Next up, dyslexia is the most common learning disability. 1 for fact, 2 for fiction. And that is a fact. So how common is it? Well, 13 to 14% of the school population qualifies for special education services. 1/2 of all students who are identified for special education are classified as having a learning disability. About 85% of those students have a primary learning disability in reading and language processing, which there's a huge overlap there with dyslexia. Some would say that it's the same, that if the learning disability is reading and language processing, then that's dyslexia. Others have different qualifications or traits that you would see within that. So as a whole, we have 15 to 20% of people with it. True or false? Dyslexia is a disease. And of course, that is false. Students with dyslexia can read proficiently. True or false? Students with dyslexia can read. Can they read proficiently? Yes, absolutely. Can they read in the advanced categories? Yes, absolutely. Many authors and PhDs have dyslexia. We'll talk about this here in a second, but structured literacy is definitely a proven approach to literacy instruction that is most likely the best fit for teaching not only dyslexic kids, but all kids. So if I were to say we need to implement some kind of reading structure, I would go with structured literacy for sure. The evidence is pretty overwhelming that that's the way to go, with some caveats, right? So sometimes people will say incorrect statements about what structured literacy is and what the science of reading is, et cetera, et cetera. So I do have to, I need to add that caveat in there. So then what should be happening at school? What can schools do to help out? There needs to be a focus on phonemic awareness. Oftentimes phonemic awareness instruction stops at like 3rd grade. So when I taught 6th grade, nobody ever told me that I should be teaching phonemic awareness. So it does tend to stop, even though it should continue, and it should especially continue for kids who maybe need a little bit of extra practice. So phonemic awareness is the ability to hear individual sounds and words by either breaking them apart or putting them together. So this is the segmenting part, this is the putting together part, or blending. Alphabet recognition and formation. There should be a lot of time spent on naming letters, producing each letter sound, and then producing each letter by hand. Naming and identifying, being able to look and, if you have the alphabet, what letter, what is letter S, and then they point to it, as well as the other way around. You have the S there, you point to it, you say, what is it? And then the students name it. Here again, explicit and systematic phonics instruction. So we have 1 to 2 syllable words, and then the text should be controlled. And what that essentially means is that the text, for instructional purposes, for the purpose to learn to read, the text should be should have letters, certain patterns like CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant, such as cat. Whatever they have been taught, that's what they should be spending their time reading, after the lesson or for homework, or when they're doing independent reading. So that's where the controlled text plays a role. Now, it's still important to introduce, it's fine for them to flip through a National Geographic, of course, and kind of look and explore. But when it comes to actually using text to increase reading ability, it should be controlled. And we can also call those decodable texts too. And then we have advanced, so this is upper elementary, where we have multisyllabic words, and then the more conventional text where it's less controlled and more based off of topic. Okay, so for fluency, again, we talk about the decodable piece, but essentially it should be within their understanding. And that might mean that for some kids, they might have, so for one kid in the class, it might be a decodable text. For another, it might not be because they don't know it yet, right? So there's some variation within a class there. And then advanced, we're really looking to have fluency practice overall with the grade level text. Okay, comprehension, instruction. Listening comprehension. So this is the cool part about listening comprehension, is that the same parts of the brain for listening comprehension are used for reading comprehension. So all of those different comprehension strategies apply, whether it's listening or reading. So in kindergarten to 1st grade, even 2nd grade, as you teach listening comprehension skills, those will transfer most likely to reading comprehension skills. Writing and expressing. This goes from words and sentences early on to paragraphs to then writing your papers. For even pretty much from fourth to 12th, they're all kind of variations on an informational piece, a narrative piece, and then writing a opinion or argumentative. So go ahead and read some of these. Here are some statements. And if you ask, let's say that you're a parent and you're talking with a school, and they say any of these things, those do require some follow-up questions. Because unfortunately, many teachers and schools are not very dyslexia informed. And so they might be doing the best that they can, but they're not necessarily always the most reliable. That said, there are some schools and some teachers that are exceptional, of course, but just because it's a school doesn't mean that we can take everything that they say at face value, especially when it comes to supporting, like if you're a parent and you're supporting your child with dyslexia, it is very important that you advocate. Sometimes, yes, it is uncomfortable, but it's also something that we have to do. Okay, now, there are times, unfortunately, where, like I said, the knowledge and awareness just isn't there. And schools can sometimes be hesitant. They can be reluctant to provide an IEP, to provide a 504 or accommodations. And so sometimes a school might say, no, your child who has dyslexia or the specific learning disorder in reading. And they'll say, because, oh, the child's grades are fine. The student is doing fine. We don't give IEPs to students who are doing fine. That is incorrect. That is false. That is, I would say, egregious, because in order to qualify for an IEP, there are two parts. The first is that the child has a qualifying disability. Okay? And dyslexia counts under the qualifying disability. And the disability adversely affects educational performance, and the child needs specialized instruction. So, the disability adversely affects educational performance. But what if the grades are A's? What if I have all A's? And that is where this can get a little bit tricky, because educational performance is a lot more than just grades. So grades are absolutely a part of it, but it also includes how a child learns, communicates, and functions at school. And so if they have A's, but it is also causing an undue amount of stress, if it is causing behavioral issues, if it leads to school anxiety and school avoidance, then those are all things that are part of educational performance. And so if your child has A's and B's and has a learning disorder, they can still qualify and should still qualify for an IEP, but there will definitely be schools that will avoid this and will initially refuse to give proper support. So, what about at home? What can parents do at home to support? So, much of this comes down to combating the negative experiences of literacy that they might get at school. And so we want to build up their confidence and make it as fun and relaxed and safe and supportive as can be. So sometimes parents, we might want to kind of course correct and maybe overcorrect by making it a little too academic and bringing that stress home all over again. So it really is a matter of attending to your kid and where your kid's at. But remember those strengths. So champion their gifts and ensure their talents are seen and supported. And if your kid's willing, you can certainly make the learning at home match what is often seen in schools. So if you want to practice you fly at home, if you want to do Haggerty at home, that's totally fine. But make sure also that they are spending time with literacy in positive ways. So making sure that they're able to engage in their hobbies and interests. Also, for many of these kids, it's those hobbies and interests that are going to compensate for weaker literacy skills. And so we want to emphasize those hobbies and interests, elevate them both so that they feel good, but also kind of knowing that, like, for many of these kids, that's what's going to, that might be their trajectory, is to follow their hobbies and passions. And then assume positive intent. If the keki's not doing well, it just means they need more support, not judgment. Remember, there's a lot of trauma that is often associated with this as well. Play and language, especially when they're young. So reading aloud, listening to audiobooks. There's a bunch of podcasts out there too that they can listen to, and that will support their vocabulary as well as their background knowledge to build those two pieces up. Then also weave wordplay, music, and broad exposure to knowledge into everyday moments to build essential reading skills. And this is one of the harder things for many parents to do, and that is to be an advocate, not just an advocate, but an empowered advocate. There will be uncomfortable moments in advocating for your kid. Again, because even though most schools and teachers have the best of intent, they don't always have the specific knowledge that parents do about dyslexia due to if you discover that your kid has dyslexia, you're going to become an expert in dyslexia pretty quickly. And for teachers, that's not necessarily the case, right? And so it will be uncomfortable at times sitting in the IEP meeting, especially if there's resistance, if there are any kind of pushback, or if they're seemingly refusing to provide the accommodations you believe that they need. That's just the uncomfortable part of it. Most parents who do choose to advocate believe that even though it's uncomfortable, it is the right thing to do because it will more likely get the services you need. Of course, we want to be polite and friendly and follow all those procedures. We need to stay calm and everything else. But it's also okay to set up boundaries and have reasonable expectations about how your child might need extra services. Here we have several different resources that can be used to learn more. You can also contact any of us. I'll come back up here. I'm pretty sure that if you type in any of our names, you'll find an email address associated with it, so you could email one of us. Thanks again for tuning in to The Wizard's Guide to Dyslexia, where we discuss dyslexia and the definition of it and the symptoms, as well as some tips and strategies for parents and teachers to use to best support your dyslexic kiddos.